Think about the last time you did something and felt, even briefly, that it was genuinely yours. Not because someone else approved it, not because it fitted what you were supposed to want, but because something in you, something underneath the performance of yourself, recognized it as true. For many people, that feeling is rare. And for some, it is so rare, they are not sure it exists at all. Donald Winnicott spent 50 years as a pediatrician and psychoanalyst asking why. He worked with children, then with their mothers, then with adults who had arrived at his consulting room unable to account for a pervasive sense that their lives, however successful, however organized, however correctly lived, were not quite happening to them. What he found, again and again, was not a dramatic pathology. It was something quieter and almost more troubling. People who had learned, very early and very thoroughly, to be someone other than themselves, and who had become so practiced at it that they had forgotten there was ever a self to be. Winnicott was born in 1,896 inches Plymouth, England, into a prosperous, respectable family. He trained first as a physician, then as a pediatrician, and only later as a psychoanalyst, a sequence that gave his thinking an unusual quality. He was always grounded in the body, in the practical, in what actually happens between real people in real rooms. He spent 4 decades doing pediatric consultations at the Paddington Green Children's Hospital in London. Over that time, he saw more than 60,000 mother-infant pairs, not case studies, not theoretical subjects, 60,000 actual relationships watched closely over years. What he noticed, what gradually became the center of his entire theoretical project, is that the infant does not begin as a self and then enter into relationship. It begins in relationship. And the self, what Winnicott called the true self, either emerges from that relationship or it does not. There is no such thing as a baby, he wrote. There is a baby and someone. That sentence is easy to read past. It is worth stopping with. What Winnicott meant is that in the beginning, the infant has no psychological existence apart from the relationship with its caregiver. The caregiver is not merely the environment in which the infant develops. The caregiver is, in those first months, constitutive of the infant's experience of being at all. This is why what the caregiver does, and more precisely, how the caregiver responds, determines not just how the infant feels, but what kind of self the infant becomes able to have. The first concept you need to understand, Winnicott, is the good enough mother, a phrase that has been quoted so often it has nearly lost its precision. So let us be precise. The good enough mother is not a mother who does everything right. She is a mother who is attuned, who responds, most of the time, to what the infant actually needs, rather than to what she needs the infant to need. Who allows the infant's own spontaneous gestures to initiate the interaction? Who mirrors back to the infant? What you are feeling is real, it matters, it is receivable. The key word is spontaneous. Winnicott believed that the infant comes into the world with something he called the true self, a set of spontaneous impulses, genuine feelings, authentic desires. Not a fully formed self, more like the raw material of one, the capacity for authentic experience. When the caregiver responds to these spontaneous gestures, when the infant reaches and is met, cries and is answered, smiles and finds the smile returned, something foundational happens. The infant begins to develop what Winnicott called a sense of continuity of being, the experience. I am here, I exist. What I feel is real and connected to what happens next. This continuity of being is not a feeling the infant has about itself. It is something more basic than that. It is the ground from which a self can emerge at all. The good enough mother does not need to be perfect. She will miss signals. She will be tired, distracted, sad, preoccupied. These ruptures are not damaging, in fact. Winnicott argued that the graduated tolerable failures of even good enough caregiving are necessary. They are what allows the infant to begin to experience itself as separate, to discover that it can tolerate frustration, that the world does not end when the breast does not arrive immediately. What matters is not perfection. What matters is the overall quality of attunement, the consistent, reliable responsiveness to what the infant actually is, not what the caregiver wishes the infant to be. And this is where things go wrong. When the caregiver is not able to respond to the infant's spontaneous gestures, when the caregiver is depressed, anxious, rigidly invested in a particular kind of infant, or simply unable to be present in the way the infant needs, the infant faces a problem. The problem is not that it goes unloved. Many caregivers who cannot attune are loving. The problem is that the infant's spontaneous gestures, the raw material of the true self, go unanswered, or are answered in a way that replaces them. The caregiver substitutes her own gesture for the infant's. The infant reaches and is met not with attunement, but with the caregiver's own need, her own anxiety, her own image of what the infant should be. And the infant, who needs the caregiver completely, who has no other resource, no other world, adapts. This adaptation is not a conscious decision. The infant does not think, I will suppress my genuine impulses in order to secure the relationship I cannot live without. It happens below language, below awareness, in the body itself. The infant learns to present to the caregiver not what it feels, but what the caregiver can receive. To initiate, not from its own spontaneity, but from a reading of what the caregiver needs to encounter. Winnicott called this the false self, and he was careful to say that some degree of false self is present in everyone, the capacity to be polite, to moderate, to present a socially appropriate face, rather than our raw interior. This is not pathology. It is civilization. What becomes pathological is when the false self takes over, when it becomes not a supplement to the true self, but a replacement for it. When the adaptation to the caregiver's needs becomes so thorough, so early, so complete, that the person grows up never having had the experience of living from their own spontaneous ground. These people function. Often they function very well. They are pleasant, capable, responsive, good at reading what others need, skilled at compliance, accomplished at appearing. They build careers, form relationships, produce children of their own. But something is missing. The life is happening, but it does not feel lived. The person is present, but not quite there. There is a persistent quality of unreality, a sense of watching themselves from a slight distance, performing rather than being, of doing the right things without knowing why, of having preferences without being sure those preferences are theirs. Understanding this requires a third concept, the holding environment. Before the infant can have a self at all, it must be held, not metaphorically, literally. The infant cannot yet regulate its own temperature, its own arousal, its own terror at the sheer undifferentiated overwhelm of being newly alive. It depends completely on a caregiver who provides what Winnicott called a holding environment. The consistent, reliable, physically and emotionally containing presence that makes existence bearable before the infant has the resources to make it bearable for itself. The holding environment is more than physical. It is the tone of voice, the timing of the response, the quality of attention. It is the caregiver's capacity to take the infant's experience seriously, to treat what the infant feels as real, important, worth responding to. Winnicott argued that what the good enough mother provides is a kind of psychic skin, not a protection from all difficulty, but a container, a sense that one's experience, however intense, is held and survivable. When the holding environment fails, when the caregiver's anxiety or depression or unavailability means that the infant's experience repeatedly goes uncontained, the infant must attempt to hold itself. And it is too small for this. The result, at the level of the developing psyche, is what Winnicott called impingement, the sense that the environment intrudes on one's being rather than supporting it. That existence is something that must be defended against rather than inhabited. The adult who grew up in insufficient holding often has a quality that is difficult to name, a hypervigilance perhaps, a perpetual sense of bracing, an inability to rest fully in any moment because some part of them is always reading the room for what might require adaptation next, a feeling that to stop performing is to disappear. There is a fourth concept, and it is perhaps the most beautiful, the transitional object. At some point in development, usually between 4 and 12 months, the infant begins to adopt a special object, a blanket, a soft toy, a piece of cloth, something that carries a particular scent, a particular texture, that the infant reaches for with an intensity that surprises everyone around it. This is not simply comfort-seeking, Winnicott argued. It is something more significant. The transitional object occupies a peculiar space. It is both created by the infant and found in the world. The infant invests it with a quality that is partly real and partly imagined. It is neither purely external nor purely internal. It exists in what Winnicott called the potential space between self and world. This matters because it is the first time the infant creates something, rather than simply responding to something. The transitional object is an act of imagination, the infant's own making, and it serves as a prototype for all later creativity, for play, for art, for culture, for every human activity in which the inner world and the outer world are brought into contact and something new emerges from that meeting. The potential space that transitional phenomena open up is, for Winnicott, where aliveness happens. It is not the place of work or duty or obligation. It is the place where the self encounters the world in a way that is both genuinely its own and genuinely engaged with what is real. When the false self dominates, this space collapses. The person has learned to respond to the world's demands rather than to meet the world with their own reality. Play becomes performance. Creativity becomes competence. Work becomes the ceaseless management of others' expectations. The potential space, the place where the true self could emerge into experience, closes. And the person lives, Winnicott said, in a state of futility. If this is landing, if the description of futility feels like something you have been living inside without a name for it, this channel is for exactly this kind of honest examination. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Not because you should, but because you want to. That distinction, Winnicott would say, is the whole question. What does all this look like in an adult? The clearest sign is compliance without conviction. The person who agrees, accommodates, adjusts, says yes without fully meaning it, not from dishonesty, but because the capacity to know what they mean has been so thoroughly organized around what others need that genuine preference has become inaccessible. There is a version of this that looks like success. The highly functioning false self is often extremely accomplished. It has learned to read environments perfectly, to produce what is required, to be whatever the situation calls for. Other people experience it as reliable, agreeable, easy to be around. What they do not experience, because the false self has learned to conceal it, is the person underneath who has no idea who they are when the performance stops. In a previous video on Karen Horney, we explored the idealized self, the tyrannical image of who the person believes they must be. Winnicott's false self is the mechanism behind that image. The idealized self is what the person performs. The false self is the performer, and the true self is the one who was never invited onto the stage. There is also a version that looks like breakdown. Winnicott noted that false self-breakdown, the moment when the adaptive compliance simply cannot be maintained any longer, often presents in therapy as the patient's first genuine experience. For many people, collapsing is the first authentic thing they have done in years, and a skilled therapist, Winnicott argued, will recognize this not as a failure, but as a beginning. The version most people know is not quite either of these. It is the ordinary, functional, undramatic falseness of a life that works but does not feel like one's own. The career, chosen because it made sense to others. The relationship maintained because leaving would be too complicated. The opinions expressed because they are the opinions of the group one belongs to. The person who asked what they actually want discovers that they do not know, not from confusion, but from a very long practice of not asking. Winnicott's concept of the good enough mother has sometimes been misread as a demand on parents, as though he were saying, "Be better, be more attuned, try harder." This is not what he meant. What he meant was something both simpler and more radical, that children do not need perfect parents. They need parents who are genuinely there, who respond, most of the time, to who the child actually is, rather than who they need the child to be. He was also, quietly, saying something about forgiveness. The parent whose own holding environment was insufficient, whose own true self was never fully met, will inevitably struggle to provide what they did not receive. The chain of impingement passes through generations, not because parents are failures, but because they are giving what they have. The work, whether in therapy or in the less formal work of examined living, is not to blame the parent. It is to recognize what was missing and to begin, gradually and imperfectly, to provide it for oneself. To become, Winnicott might say, a good enough mother to one's own true self. Winnicott did not leave a simple practice. His work was always more diagnostic than prescriptive. He was better at naming what had gone wrong than at issuing instructions for repair. But there is something in the spirit of his work that points toward a specific kind of attention. The question is not, am I doing the right thing? That is the false self's question. The false self is extremely good at doing the right thing. The question is, does this feel like mine? Not, is it impressive? Not, will others approve? Not, does it fit the person I have been performing? But, is there something in me that recognizes this as genuine? Is there a quality of spontaneity, of aliveness, of being actually here rather than watching myself be here? This is a difficult question to answer if you have spent a long time not asking it. The true self, when it has been hidden for decades, does not announce itself loudly. It appears in small things, in the activity that does not feel like effort, in the conversation that does not feel like performance, in the moment when you say something and it is, surprisingly, what you actually think. Winnicott called these moments of aliveness, and he argued quietly, without drama, that they are what life is for. Donald Winnicott died in 1971. He never wrote a single major systematic work. His ideas are scattered across essays, lectures, radio broadcasts, clinical papers, the accumulated thinking of a man who was always more interested in the particular case in front of him than in the theoretical edifice. But what he left, taken together, is one of the most honest accounts of why so many people arrive at adult life feeling vaguely unreachable to themselves, not because they are broken, not because they made wrong choices, but because the self that would have made choices from a genuine center never quite got to be. In a previous video on Irvin Yalom, we explored intrapersonal isolation, the disconnection from one's own inner life, the split between what a person actually feels and what they allow themselves to know they feel. Winnicott is the developmental account of how that split is created. Yalom names the injury. Winnicott traces it to its origin. The good news, and Winnicott was, in his quiet way, an optimist, is that the true self does not disappear. It goes into hiding. It waits. The capacity for spontaneous, authentic experience is not destroyed by the false self's dominance. It is obscured. And what has been hidden can, given sufficient safety, be found again. The holding environment can be created at any age. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but good enough. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper. Live clearer.